We are very fortunate to have Olivier De Schutter, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty. He is also a professor on human rights law at UC Leuven and Sciences Po, and an extremely well-known scholar, academic, activist indeed, who I've had the great privilege of working with also on the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So Olivier, the floor is yours.
Many thanks indeed, Sandy, and very warm welcome to everyone on this important discussion. In his submission to the Commission for Social Development, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres mentions the following. He writes in his report to the Commission, "Understanding poverty and finding solutions to eradicate it must rest on an approach based on the dignity and respect of the person and their rights. Dignity implies, inter alia, non-discrimination on any grounds." I think this is an important recognition that the fight against discrimination is essential to break the cycles that perpetuate poverty. Discrimination is not only a violation of human rights, it's also a considerable cost to society as a whole. It leads people to reduce their investments in human capital, in acquiring qualifications, in being trained, in seeking to improve their qualifications. It lowers confidence. It leads to professional segregation due to the lack of role models, as too few people have crossed social barriers, and it leads to low aspirations, both of parents and of adolescents and young adults. This is why the 2012 Guiding Principles on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, approved by the Human Rights Council, mentions that people with the experience of poverty live in a vicious cycle of powerlessness, stigmatization, discrimination, exclusion, and material deprivation, which all mutually reinforce one another. So implementing the promise made in Article 2, Paragraph 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which prohibits discrimination on grounds of social origin and property, translated into Spanish as posición económica, showing that the intention was really to challenge class-based discrimination. That promise is extremely important to keep, at least if it is not understood narrowly and naively as promoting meritocracy. As we all know, merit is often ignoring the disadvantages that people in poverty have faced in early childhood and later. And I believe myself that real equality of opportunities requires much more to be done. If we focus only on merit, we will not allow people to have real chances in life. We need to provide families with decent housing, adequate nutrition, healthcare, strong social protection, robust minimum wage legislation, in the absence of which this idea that merit should determine access to social goods will be meaningless for people coming from a low-income background. Now, what does it mean to combat discrimination on grounds of poverty? What does it mean to go beyond a naive, meritocratic-based interpretation of this requirement? In my view, it means three things. First, it means we need to address not only direct discrimination on grounds of socioeconomic disadvantage, but also indirect discrimination. Direct discrimination means, for example, that we should not allow landlords to refuse to lease an apartment to a person living on social aid. We should not allow a bank to refuse a person to open an account because the person has no sufficient or regular income. We should not allow school officials to remain passive when pupils are being bullied by their classmates because they come from from low-income families. But we also must combat indirect discrimination. For example, when employers do not hire a job applicant residing in a certain neighborhood, or does not accept as interns, as trainees, people coming from schools that have a reputation for disproportionately being populated by children from low social economic background. And so discrimination, properly understood, should include not only direct instances where low incomes are the basis for a decision being made about a person, but also indirect discrimination, where people in poverty disproportionately are affected by certain policies, processes that are neutral on their face. Secondly, it means seeking individualized solutions to accommodate the specific circumstances of people with experience of poverty. In recruitment processes today, we see a shift currently from the focus on diplomas and formal qualifications to other so-called social and soft skills, for example, good communication skills. And this may be a problem for people in poverty because, of course, it gives great importance to the role of social networks, which very often they don't manage to mobilize. It gives great importance to cultural capital, which they have no access to. But that shift away from diplomas and formal qualifications can also be an asset, an opportunity, forcing employers to reflect about their practices and identify how people in poverty can actually enrich the understanding of certain issues, bringing a new perspective to the table when a company makes a decision. That is what reasonable accommodation is all about. It's about adapting the institution, the definition of the task, the working environment, the learning environment, etc., to the specific characteristics of the individual concerned. This means moving from societies that see social exclusion as an inevitable price to pay for competitiveness to inclusive societies that value and cherish diversity. Thirdly, and finally, to understand discrimination, how important it is to combat discrimination against poverty, we need to understand discrimination as requiring affirmative action policies to be adopted in order to overcome the systemic nature of discrimination faced by people in poverty. People in poverty are not only discriminated against in employment, or in access to healthcare, or in access to education, or in access to housing. They are discriminated against in all areas of life. So that, for example, even if you remove discriminatory practices against people in poverty in employment, if they don't have access to the right schools, if they live far away from where employment opportunities exist and are discriminated in access to certain neighborhoods, they still will not be able to have access to decent employment. They still will be deprived from having the opportunity to earn decent livelihoods. And therefore, we need affirmative action policies to be implemented in order to address this systemic discrimination. That is a way to improve inclusion, of course, of people in poverty in certain areas of life. It's also a way to break down stereotypes. We have many studies that show that interaction with persons in poverty reduces the stereotypes that people entertain against them and can increase, therefore, social tolerance. We have, for example, very interesting studies from schools in Delhi that were forced by judicial order to accept children from low-income families, forcing these elite schools to become more diversified in their composition and leading, in turn, rich pupils to become much more understanding of the situation of poor pupils or pupils from low castes. And finally, affirmative action is a way to increase confidence by providing role models to people in poverty that can seek inspiration from those who have succeeded thanks to those affirmative action policies. And it's a way to overcome the aspirations gap, the lowered expectations that parents and adolescents sometimes have about future adult lives. And so for all these reasons, I think it's important to combat discrimination on grounds of poverty, but to use discrimination in the full sense of the expression, with all these consequences that should be included in the prohibition of discrimination on grounds of socioeconomic disadvantage. Many thanks.